As I mentioned in a previous video, Watchtower's publications were extremely helpful in aiding me into the truth, the real truth. One reason is the arbitrary way they often choose to interpret scriptures. Their explanations don't seem to add up upon closer inspection. Aside from the changes in the generation doctrine that I spoke about in that other video, I think the first major doubt I can remember having about my faith was sparked by the Insight book. And this was, I believe, around the year 2011, give or take a year or two. I remember it was definitely before the JW Library app had been released. In some ways, this is a more severe doubt than the generation thing because this was the first time I seriously doubted the Bible itself and not just the dependability of one of the society's predictions. So you're probably wondering, well, what is this doubt? What is this Insight book entry? In the Insight book, under the entry for heaven, it says that the Hebrew word for heaven is shemayim, or really heavens, as it is always plural. It goes on to describe how this can refer to the physical heavens, such as the cloudy skies, but I was more interested in the spiritual heavens, God's abode. So under the subheading, spiritual heavens, it says, the same original language words used for the physical heavens are also applied to the spiritual heavens. Now, at that point, I'm like, wait, what? The first thing that comes to my mind is, how can the translators tell the difference between the physical sky and the spiritual realm where Jehovah and the angels are supposed to live in some sort of alternate dimension? Then the next thing that comes to my mind is, are you sure these ancient Hebrews didn't think God was literally floating around in the sky because they just didn't understand the earth's makeup or outer space? I mean, that would explain why the Bible repeatedly describes Jehovah as being on a pillar of cloud or in a dark cloud and things along that line. And maybe even the reason why Jesus was seen being lifted up into the sky on a cloud. But cognitive dissonance kicked in. I comforted myself with the idea that the Bible had known the earth was a sphere, even though it actually says circle. So I guess I could trust it. And the brothers had figured out 1914 in advance, or so I thought at the time. So I figured I could trust them too. But that wasn't the last time I saw holes in their reasoning. In Watchtower publications, their statements are often followed by a scriptural citation, implying that the verses referenced will substantiate the preceding teaching. And when you actually look up the verses that were cited, sometimes you can see the connection in how they arrived at that conclusion. But in my experience as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, there are many times when you find yourself thinking, wow, I would never have known that's what this scripture meant unless I had read this article from the Faithful and Discreet Slave. And even though you can't work out in your head how they arrived at their explanation, you know as part of JW culture that you're supposed to feel grateful that the organization is supplying you with spiritual food at the proper time, as they say. Yet there are also those times when the question lingers in your mind, how did they come up with this teaching? One example can be found in the book Pay Attention to Daniel's Prophecy. Okay, there's probably way more than one example, probably hundreds in this book. Don't even get me started on the kings of the north and south. But we're about to look at one example of a poor scriptural citation on page 298 of that book. In the box, Removal of the Constant Feature, it says, in the book of Daniel, the term constant feature occurs 5 times. It refers to a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of the lips, regularly offered to Jehovah God by his servants. And then it cites Hebrews 13:15, which says, through him, let us always offer to God a sacrifice of praise, that is, the fruit of our lips, that make public declaration to his name. Okay, so this verse shows that praise can be considered a sacrifice, but it does nothing to show that this is what Daniel was referring to, nor does it show that Daniel connects to anything in the 20th century. Yet the book goes on to claim that the removal of the constant feature took place toward the end of World War I, when the preaching work was all but suspended in mid-1918. And then there are the verses that mention the land of decoration.
Let's consider together the words of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 41. It says, he will also enter into the land of the decoration. Now let's stop there. We have long held that the land of the decoration is the spiritual estate of Jehovah's people.
Yeah, but why though? It seems like this verse could easily just be talking about the land of Judah. Just because a belief has been long held does not mean that it's correct or that it's supported by evidence. That's one of the reasons why Watchtower frequently changes their doctrines, especially when they try to read extra meanings into ancient so-called prophecies that were never meant to be applied to our day. Another example is in the April 15th, 2009 Watchtower article, Jehovah's Wisdom Observed in Creation, paragraphs 15 and 16, which say, the prophet Joel compared the activity of Jehovah's servants to the actions of locusts. And then it quotes Joel chapter 2, verse 7 and 8, which says, they charge like warriors, they scale a wall like soldiers, each keeps to his own course, and they do not swerve from their paths. They do not shove one another, each man advances in his course. If the weapons, or missiles, cause some to fall, the others do not break ranks. Now, there's nothing in these verses to suggest that Joel is even referring to Jehovah's people in ancient times, let alone the activities of Jehovah's Witnesses in modern times. But then paragraph 16 starts by saying how well this prophecy describes modern-day proclaimers of God's kingdom. And it goes on to draw all these comparisons in an attempt to further demonstrate that that's what these verses were describing. But as I mentioned before, they often change their interpretation of scriptures, which is sometimes referred to as new light. Typically, this is not just an expansion of detail on the old teaching, but a completely different understanding with the opposite meaning from the old doctrine in many cases, which could raise the question, was the old teaching actually the truth? Or was it just an interpretation, an opinion, that turned out to be incorrect? For example, as we've just considered, Watchtower taught that the locusts mentioned at Joel chapter 2 represent Jehovah's people in modern times as they engage in their preaching work. After teaching this for many years, in the April 2020 Watchtower study article, An Attack Coming from the North, they changed their official interpretation. The verses now mean that the locusts represent the Babylonian army in ancient times as they engage in warfare. This is quite a different interpretation. First of all, the fulfillment of this scripture is now considered to only be in ancient times, not modern. Also, Babylon is considered a symbol of false religion, essentially worshippers of Satan the devil, far from being worshippers of Jehovah, actively preaching about him. In fact, they were enemies of Jehovah's people.
That's not good. So it's looking like these locusts are not good people.
Jehovah was only allowing their evil to be unleashed on his people to punish them, which in itself is quite twisted and abusive if you ask me. But we're not here to talk about how horrible the character of Jehovah is today. The point is, they cited scriptures when they taught the old understanding, and they cited scriptures as they taught the newer understanding. Mostly the same scriptures, in fact. So if the Bible didn't change, then what did change? Isn't it just that times change and men change their minds? And if that's the case, then how can you really call it the truth? If the religion is referred to as the truth, then the question arises of how can two different teachings with opposite meanings from the same organization both be true? And if at least one of those interpretations is not true, then how can the religion be called the truth? At some point, they've clearly been teaching something other than the truth. One could attempt to credit them for being humble enough to correct their mistakes, but it remains just that, their mistakes, not God's. So clearly the teachings come from them and their opinions, not God. The same could be said of virtually any religion, by the way. People have lived and died for teachings that amount to nothing more than the opinions of men about an old book written by other men. Again, this is also true of other religions. All the governing body does is read the Bible, try and guess at what it means, and then seek to fill the role they think it's describing. That's what any ordinary person could do. It's what many religious and even cult leaders have done. If that's the only thing qualifying the governing body as God's channel of dispensing spiritual food, what gives them a monopoly on truth? One might even conclude that it would be presumptuous to say that they're the only spokesperson that God is using.
And do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth?
That I think would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using. The scriptures clearly show that someone can act in harmony with God's Spirit in giving comfort and help in the congregations. But if I could just clarify a little, going back to Matthew 24, clearly Jesus said that in the last days, and Jehovah's Witnesses believe these are the last days, there would be a slave, a group of persons who would have responsibility to care for the spiritual food. So in that respect, we view ourselves as trying to fulfill that role.
Once you fully accept the fact that the governing body is neither inspired nor infallible, and that they can err in both doctrinal matters and organizational direction, as stated in the February 15th, 2017 Watchtower on page 26, then you have to ask yourself why you're not allowed to question their direction or teachings, which they've admitted might be wrong. You have to start asking yourself why you're not allowed to question a man's opinion, why you're not allowed to hear what other people have to say about the organization or the Bible, and then make up your own mind. And then suddenly you realize that you are allowed to. You give yourself that permission. And at that point, you stop being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and you somehow become an apostate, even if that was not your intention. Because now you're thinking independently, which, as we all know, is something that a good JW would never do.
I guess I just thought, and that's the problem. Relying on my own thinking.
More on that horrendous convention next time. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing your comments. Have you ever had one of those surreal moments where the logic in a Watchtower video or publication is so bad that it makes you question your whole life and worldview? Let me know about it in the comment section. And let me know what you thought of this video. If you enjoyed something in the video, then please tap the thumbs up button to let me know. And please subscribe to stay tuned for future videos. Thanks for watching.